Feminists claim gay rights activism as feminist territory. But is it? Or is this another example of the movement looking for a pre-existing staple of proxy victims they can whore out for political capital? Last week, we took a break from examining feminist lies to give our readers a much-needed legal update. Today, we return to our Accountability Gap series just in time for a grand cup of alphabet soup. Most folks, if asked, would tell you that alternative or queer sexualities are a progressive or feminist issue. Because religion has been commonly associated with efforts to control human sexuality, and religion has also been fundamentally connected to the political right, the far left, authoritarian as it is, was able to easily make gay rights issues theirs almost by default. In truth, however, the party responsible for sodomy law was the authoritarian state. In English common law, this really began in 1533 when homosexuality went from a morality issue between the individual and the church to a criminal offense after King Henry VIII passed the Buggery Act, making sodomy a capital crime. Yes, this is the same king whose attack on the church over his own sexual interests led to the dissolution of the monasteries, the poor becoming the state's problem instead of the church's concern, and the eventual development of a welfare system, followed by the creation of England's poor laws to keep it in check. That King Henry. King Hypocrite, Henry VIII, was not the last word on sexuality in Britain. The 1533 Buggery Act was repealed in 1553 by Queen Mary in favor of the church handling such matters, then re-established by Queen Elizabeth in 1563, then repealed again and replaced by Section 15 of the Offences Against the Person Act of 1828, and Section 63 of India's 1828 Criminal Law Act, based on both of which sodomy remained a capital offence. In 1861, a new version of the UK's Offences Against the Person Act finally repealed the death penalty, but imposed 10 years' labour. Cunnilingus was excluded from the definition of sodomy throughout these legal changes, leaving lesbians free from prosecution. U.S. sodomy laws were basically inherited from English common law. There was not a time during the nation's history when such laws were not a part of its various criminal codes, as by the time we became a nation, they were an entrenched part of the existing legal system on which ours was based. Like English common law, most U.S. sodomy laws excluded cunnilingus from their definition. In the 30s, it became more common to see it prosecuted under crime against nature, obscenity, or indecent act, but even then, the treatment differed, with lesbians considered to be misguided, while gay men were often described in inhuman terms. And throughout this history, men were the ones primarily being targeted. Yes, there was legal and social discrimination in response to homosexuality in both sexes. Historically, both sexes faced career damage, being ostracized, prosecution, legal penalties, bizarre attempts at psychiatric manipulation, including the use of rape as a form of therapy, and in the 20th century, sterilization. Gay men also faced imprisonment, forced labor, peer violence including the risk of being murdered, and, up to a point in history, execution. In some nations governed by Sharia law today, they still do. Historians with a gay and lesbian issues focus claim this difference is because early legislators couldn't imagine lesbianism existed, but in reality, it was simply largely ignored, unless blatant and open, as with Eva Kochever's early 20th century lesbian sex club, Eve Adams Tea Room, in Greenwich Village, New York, which was raided after she published her book Lesbian Love, drawing attention to herself and her establishment. The same occurred with the move to prosecute cunnilingus, which followed the somewhat mainstreaming of lesbianism in the 20s, and publicity surrounding the 1926 lesbian-themed play The Captive. Prior to the 20th century, gay rights activism had been scarce and was really not public due to the risk of being arrested and up to a point possibly executed for simply admitting one's sexuality. The first known Western gay rights organization was the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, established in 1897 by German scientist Magnus Hirschfeld, publisher Max Spohr, lawyer Edward Oberg, and writer Franz Joseph von Bülow. This organization was founded to fight for the abolition of paragraph 175 of the German Imperial Penal Code, which also criminalized sexual contact between men. Noticing a pattern yet? In conjunction with that goal, the organization engaged in extensive educational efforts and produced research and publications. The British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology was founded by Edward Carpenter and Havelock Ellis in 1914 for education and advocacy, and the Society for Human Rights was founded in Illinois in 1924 by German immigrant Henry Gerber. While these organizations existed and engaged in efforts at education and decriminalizing sodomy, their activism was not extremely public. Doing so was a dangerous prospect, as there was backlash from local police wherever gay men congregated. Lesbians were also hassled depending on their location, but their activities were still not criminalized on the level that men's were. In fact, in some areas, tolerance for lesbian activities was such that bars like Mona's 440 Club, founded in 1933 in San Francisco, attracted tourists. In the 50s, Harry Hay founded the Modeshine Society, a group to protect and improve the rights of gay men. Its name is a reference to a French medieval society of masked players, the Société Modeshine, as a statement on the public masking of homosexuality. Because the Modeshine Society brought gay rights activism more into the open in the U.S., Harry Hay is seen by many as the father of the gay rights movement. Founded in 1950 in San Francisco, by 1953, the organization was the subject of an FBI internal security investigation lasting into 1956. During that same time, the U.S.'s first lesbian rights organization, Daughters of Bilitis, was formed, initially as a more private social alternative to lesbian bars. This was partly a result of police harassment of gay and lesbian bars after World War II in the wake of anti-communist sentiment and government designation of homosexuals as subversives, and partly in response to lesbian bars' tendency to attract tourists. The organization's initial activism involved addressing the lack of available information for lesbians regarding female homosexuality. Their mission was subsequently expanded to educating the public and lobbying to destigmatize and decriminalize lesbian sex. It wasn't really until the last third of the 20th century that gay and lesbian rights activism began to make visible headway. And while in the UK this took the form of a series of small but increasing legal victories, in typical American fashion the US kicked this off with a good old-fashioned riot. On June 28, 1969, police pulled an early morning raid on a mafia-run New York City gay bar called the Stonewall Inn, declining to tip off the bar's owners ahead of time. They entered with a warrant, and in addition to making arrests, began roughing up patrons. For once, bystanders did not disperse but remained on site, becoming increasingly irate. The initial rioting began when a lesbian hit on the head by her arresting officer yelled for onlookers to do something, and lasted for 45 minutes with police barricading themselves inside the bar as the rioters attempted to set the place on fire. They had to be rescued by the riot squad and fire department. It had been primarily men whose blood, sweat, and tears had built the foundation for public advocacy. But the final spark, setting that fire under everyone's asses, was still society's protective attitude toward a woman. 5 days of protests followed, galvanizing gay, lesbian, and trans activists, leading to more open public activism and the creation of numerous gay rights organizations. This led to an explosion of public activism in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, with men as the backbone and workhorses of these organizations, the bulk of the army of hands, feet, and faces upon which the movement's humanization depended. The movement fought sodomy laws state by state, won funding for AIDS research, brought about changes in military policy, lobbied anti-discrimination law and policy into place, and led society to an understanding that has, for many, made coming out of the closet pretty much anticlimactic. There is still social prejudice to deal with, but a war has been fought and won in terms of law and policy. The gulf between the needs behind gay rights activism and lesbian activism in the West, not the least of which was that stark gap in compassion, is not inconsistent with the rest of the world, in that laws criminalizing same-sex intercourse primarily target male couples, therefore making human rights activism in this arena primarily about removing the bullseye from gay men's heads. Even today, when the vast majority of the world's nations do not criminalize non-heterosexual relationships, of those that do, some do not criminalize lesbian sex, while there are none which do criminalize lesbian sex without also criminalizing male homosexuality. In terms of human rights, gay rights activist history is primarily a history of men slowly and strategically pushing back against total dehumanization, and women quietly, then when the way has been opened, more publicly seeking validation. Every modicum of human consideration the movement won before the mid-20th century, and much of what was won since then, has been on the backs of those male activists. While the journey lesbians and bisexual women took from closet to comfortable in public wasn't a cakewalk, everyone who falls under the umbrella term queer owes male activists more than the movement today will ever admit. Now, feminists have claimed ownership of the movement, now that it's a mostly safe platform with a built-in historical victim narrative they can exploit. They're not going to acknowledge gay men's history. They're going to use gay men's activism and then turn around and claim credit for it, the same as they do with everything men have given them. The question is, are you going to let them?